Good morning. My name is Len Losik. I'm President and Chief Technical Officer of a company called Failure Analysis, located in Santa Cruz, California. And I want to discuss with you the results of my research that I did for the Canadian Space Agency. The technology that my company works in is called Prognostics Health Management, or PHM. And for the first time, it allows behavior to be predicted with certainty rather than in probabilities. And we license the technology as well as provide engineering services as a way of being able to compare bids from different companies for the purchase of very complex military weapon systems. The government and the military needed some process to be able to compare one bid, against another and another, and quite often they get 3 or 4 or 5 bids. Well, how do you compare them? So since they did not tell the contractors to go back and figure out why their equipment was failing prematurely so often, they came up with using probability analysis and deal in probabilities. And so the contractors were able to simply complete some what's called stochastic equations in their proposal to the customer that showed that the likelihood of a failure occurring on their bid, on their system that they were bidding to the customer was better than 85% of success rate, or better than 90%. Whatever probability the government would specify or the military customer would specify for that weapon, the companies could complete the equations, the stochastic equations, and show that they met that probability requirement. Rather than having the contractors meet the real-life reliability of 100%, the contractors were allowed to build equipment knowing that some of them were going to fail prematurely. And over the decades, from what was a favor to the contractors to be able to get very complex weapon systems fielded by going to probabilities and not having them figure out why their equipment was so unreliable, it has now become the contractor's statement that they are not required to produce equipment that doesn't fail prematurely. And now it is actually in the contract, and the way they choose to interpret the contract is that they get to produce equipment that fails prematurely with no consequences whatsoever. And this is equipment that the American taxpayer pays for, whether it's NASA or whether it's military space systems or weapon systems. This is the way that the contractor gets to interpret the reliability of their systems, that they are actually allowed to produce equipment that will fail prematurely. And these are the types of mathematics that are involved for the contractors must use, and these are probability distributions, and that these relate to, this is a cumulative distribution, which I believe is the integral of the probability. These are the mathematics that are now used by the contractors to come up with the reliability and probabilities that the customer specifies for their weapon systems. And this is the mathematics that's used for them. And the mathematics deals with what's called stochastic equations, which are fictional. They're created using information about the system that seems to be important, but in fact is really unrelated to how any one particular system is how reliable it's going to be. And so in the technology that my company works in, which is PHM, which was developed to be able to identify which equipment is going to fail prematurely while it's still at the factory so that it can be removed and replaced with one that won't. Well, this is a very simple explanation of how it works. And so what we deal with is time series information, volts, amps, degrees, in Fahrenheit or centigrade, coming from the equipment. And when we analyze that time series data, we end up with the results is called diagnostic data. When we look at this time series data, what do we conclude? And our conclusions is what's called diagnostic data. Well, in PHM, instead of stopping there at the diagnostic data, which is done now, we analyze the results of the diagnostic data. And from the results of our analysis of the results of the diagnostics, we are then able to come up with what's called prognostic data, or the data that allows us to be able to predict what's going to happen to that equipment that this time series data was from. And then if we take the results of our prognostic analysis, if we then analyze the results of our prognostic analysis, that then gives us the amount of life left in the equipment. How much longer is that equipment going to last? Is it going to be 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, or a year? And we call that a prognostic data, or determine what the day the failure, we are able to determine the remaining usable life of that equipment, even to the point where we can predict what day it's going to fail on. And so this is the simple explanation of how we are able to do what we do with PHM technology. This is a chart that I added to show you. I told you about how PHM technology is being used in the investment industry, the financial industry and Wall Street. This is a chart trying to show the sale price of a stock and how the algorithms are developed by mathematicians, showing when to buy and when to sell. So this, for people who can understand the financial predictions, this is the type of analysis that's now embedded in the predictive algorithms that have been used to replace stockbrokers to decide what investments to make and when to buy and when to sell. So, as I mentioned earlier, what initiated our research into mental illness? Again, it was the Canadian Space Agency who asked us to determine the feasibility of using our proprietary predictive algorithms to predict astronauts in training if any of them were going to acquire mental illness. And we published the results initially for the IEEE AIAA at the Aerospace Conference held in Big Sky, Montana in 2013, titled Using the Brain's Fight-or-Flight Response for Predicting Mental Illness on the Human Spaceflight Program. And again, we completed it for the CSA, and then they edited our publication to only include depression and anxiety. And so, why did we look at? I mean, why did we want to look at applying PHM to mental illness? And that was because we specialized in premature aging, and we wanted to see if mental illness, if there was a component of mental illness that was related to premature aging. And this is an example which we knew about, I think everybody knows about, what happens to the presidents of the United States what they look like when they first go into office and then when they come out. And you can see that, Abraham Lincoln, the 2 terms, Lincoln, 2 terms from Barack Obama, and then 2 terms from George Bush. And what happens to people who are under continuous stress? They age prematurely. And I'm going to explain how that happens. So we looked for the source of premature aging in the body, and we identified the cause of premature aging to overexposure from 2 chemicals, that of cortisol and adrenaline, that are both released each time that the fight or flight response is activated, meaning that our subconscious has decided it's detected danger in some way, activates the fight or flight response, which is the subconscious. When the fight or flight response is activated, it's no longer the subconscious. When the fight or flight response is not active, it's the subconscious. Same brain. And so what we did was we found cortisol and adrenaline, and that's the result of premature aging in fetuses, in adults, and children. Remember that fetuses have pretty much all of their systems working, including their fight or flight response. So if the fetus who can hear everything that's going on, if its fight or flight response decides, hey, I'm in danger,
it's going to release adrenaline and cortisol when its fight or flight response is activated. So from published research by others, we found that the brain of the mentally ill also experiences what's called self-induced brain damage and shrinkage of the frontal lobes, which is primarily where our impulse control and our decision making, we believe, occurs, is in our frontal lobes, from the excessive presence of cortisol and adrenaline. So we proposed that both were present from the person's fight or flight response that controls their release. And so by living in a high stress environment where you're activating your fight or flight response, it immediately suppresses your immune system is the very first thing it does. It doesn't need it. In a fight or flight response, it has no need for the immune system, so it just forgets about it briefly, and so it turns it off. And so that while it's off, it allows whatever the immune system is controlling in our body to start reproducing again. It's no longer under control, and that's primarily viruses. So each time the fight or flight response is activated, the very first thing it does is deactivates the immune system and releases cortisol and adrenaline to take action. So the process that we came up with in order to be able to predict which astronauts in training that were going to acquire a mental illness sometime during its long duration space mission was we used the medical industry. We said the medical industry identified that the PHM analysis is used by the medical industry, and then PHM was already adopted by the aerospace industry in building commercial and military aircraft. But historically, the aerospace industry in fact, neither the medical industry or the aerospace industry ever used the concept of premature aging for its different parts. That's new, so we brought that in. So we identified the presence of premature aging in piece parts that was being caused by, that were being seen by what we were calling non-repeatable transient events. And then we proposed to identify to Canadian Space Agency the presence of premature aging in the brain of astronauts. And what's funny about the non-repeatable transient event, years ago, back in the 50s or 60s, during the old traditional family organization where the father went off to work and the mom stayed home and took care of the house and raised the children. And anytime that she had errands to do, she'd ask the husband, "Hey, can I drop you off at work because I need the car today?" And so what would happen is she would be out driving and she would hear a clunk. And of course, nothing would happen, but she just noted that, hey, what the heck was that? And so at the end of the day, when her husband would come home, she'd tell her husband, "Honey, today while I was driving, I heard this clunk that I'd never heard before. I had no idea what it was, but anyway, the car kept running, and I just want to let you know what I heard." Well, usually about 6 or 7 weeks later, they need a new transmission or have to have their transmission rebuilt. And so at that time, we did not associate that clunk, or at least most of us didn't, the clunk that the mother and wife heard, that 6 or 7 weeks later, there was going to need a major repair. That same phenomena where I'm talking about exists within the commercial and military aircraft industry, where the pilots will feel or hear something strange occur somewhere on the aircraft, and it will only occur once. They'll bring it in the aircraft and have it serviced, and the maintenance people will call it several things. They got many labels for it. They'll an RTOK, which stands for retest was okay, meaning they couldn't find any problem with any of the equipment, or no failure found, an NFF, or a no failure identified, an NFI. And at no point is any equipment replaced or any repairs done. And the aircraft is then sent back out, and then 3 weeks later, a major component within the avionics equipment fails, and the aircraft comes back in. This has been a phenomena that has occurred more often the more complex our aircraft get, but it's a real problem with the maintenance of both our military aircraft as well as our commercial aircraft. And it's PHM technology that connects the non-repeatable transient event to the end of life of the equipment for which it occurred in. Previous to PHM, probability analysis stated that no past behavior of any equipment or any data could be associated with any future equipment. Thereby, you could not predict with certainty what's going to happen. In probability analysis, so that it won't get replaced, it put in a caveat that said, no data from the past is related to future, so you can never be able to predict equipment behavior. And that's what we have believed for the last 60 years in the space program, as well as many other industries. And it's the PHM technology that says that's wrong. We can now predict with certainty that past behavior is related to future behavior, and we can predict things now with certainty. This is a chart that describes what PHM technology is used within the aerospace industry. And this is nothing more than what I said earlier about embedding the predictive algorithms into the equipment, allowing the equipment on the aircraft to talk directly to the equipment on the ground with no person involved. And so, but when the aircraft lands, the equipment on the ground has already ordered up the equipment that needs to be replaced or the maintenance that needs to be done, and it's sitting waiting for the aircraft to land so that the maintenance can be done to it, and that's called condition-based maintenance. These are the two examples of within the aircraft industry. Boeing's new 787 was designed completely around PHM technology, as well as the latest fighter called the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter by the Air Force, used by the Navy and Marines. These are both completely designed around PHM technology. The equipment on board communicates directly with the equipment on the ground, so that when these aircraft land, the equipment, what needs to be done to each of them is already ready to go. It doesn't have to be rolled into the maintenance yard or deck and have maintenance people look at it. It's prognosed itself and then communicated that information to the ground. PHM, the analysis that we do is called a prognostic analysis. It illustrates the presence of premature aging that precedes all failures and death from diseases. So if we had the chance to collect time series data from patients, we would be able to show the presence of premature aging and be able to predict, much like the doctors do now, predict the remaining usable life for terminally ill patients. This is a chart that describes some of our proprietary algorithms, just simply the names of them. There's about 18 or 19 of them. And these are designed to be used in a completely full of electronic noise environment, either RF and or electrical. So each one of these is a particular algorithm that is used to find specific things. So this is an example of a NASA, this is the Extreme Ultraviolet Explorer satellite that was a sister ship to the Hubble telescope. That Hubble worked in visible light. This worked in extreme ultraviolet frequencies. And this satellite, which cost, I think $300 million for this satellite, it was built, the payload was built at UC Berkeley, and the support structure that provided everything it needed was built by a company called Fairchild that got bought by Orbital. So this is an orbital spacecraft with the telescope built by UC Berkeley Space Sciences Laboratory. This was launched into space in order to generate this map. And what this map is, this is what's called an all-sky 360-degree map of sources for extreme ultraviolet energy. And this sat up about 325 miles up in space. Lasted about 8 years in space. So each one of these dots is a source for extreme ultraviolet energy. And then in our facility, we had this data available, and then visiting scientists from all over the world would come over and do research on this data and write their thesis, their PhD thesis, or their master's project. But this data was available to the principal engineer whoever at UC Berkeley, I think for the first year, and then after that, the visiting scientists had access to all of the data that was collected by this satellite for these extreme EUV sources out in space. I was hired to do a prognostic analysis using our technology on the data, the engineering data on the health and status of the equipment on board this satellite, $300 million satellite. I was hired to do that. And then I wanted to show you guys examples of the kind of results that we get when we process time series data. So on the satellite, there was 3 gyroscopes. Only one's needed at any given time, but they put 3 on to make sure that it lasts, it had I can't remember, I think it was a 2 or 3 year mission life. So we had data, the same data from 3 different gyros, and these are gyroscopes that are able to determine position, attitude in space, as well as any motion, whether or not the satellite was moving and how fast it was moving. And so this data was processed. We were looking at the motor current out of each gyro, and this is what it would look like normally for these 2. And when we process the data, same data from this gyro, using our predictive algorithms, this is what showed up. And this is what we call, generally speaking, a non-repeatable transient event. Now, this data, before we got to it, was looked at by the manufacturer in the way that they process the data, and they did not see this at all. They did not see this. It took our analysis to be able to identify this. From this point on, we could then predict how much usable life that gyroscope had, and sure enough, it lasted just what we said it was going to, and this is where it failed. And this is where we predict. This is what the gyroscope, the 3-pack gyroscope looked like, and so we predicted it was going to fail at this time, and it did. This is similar process for the gyroscope C unit. For this one right here, it had the failure process hadn't begun yet. Later on, it did, and so we did the analysis, and we looked for the transient event in the data under the motor current, and sure enough, on all 3 of this processing, where this was, I think, this is the raw engineering data processed. This, I think, was like the standard deviation, and this might have been the average. But the change in behavior occurred in all 3, and then from this point on, we were able to predict the remaining usable life, when it was going to fail, and that's when it failed. It failed when we predicted. So those were examples of the kinds of things that we do with the predictive algorithms, the results. And this is the chart that is meant to show what a predictive algorithm, how you develop a predictive algorithm. But what an algorithm is, it's just simply a set of rules. Whatever rules, whatever process that you need, it can be considered an algorithm. A lot of people think that algorithms only exist in software. And what the goal is for repeatability is to put algorithms in software so that you can get repeatable results. But sometimes the use of software is simply part of the algorithm. There might be a manual part of the algorithm that people have to do, which may include using particular software tools, and then that becomes the part of the algorithm itself. But normally people think of algorithms only that they go in software, but algorithms are just simply any set of rules, and we happen to use them for predicting the actions with 100% certainty that illustrate the presence of premature aging, and then which by the way is usually in normal appearing data. And we do both model-based and data-driven algorithms, as well as a combination of both. And technically speaking, which I'm doing a lot of, what we do is we demodulate our predictive algorithms. We demodulate the behavior in the data to find the premature aging. Modulation and demodulation, that's the term that we use when we add information on a signal, either electrical or RF signal. That's how we add intelligence or information onto electrical signals. And then we use that same terminology to describe how we are able to find premature aging. So, how is the cause of mental illness related to autism, cancer, diabetes, arthritis, autoimmune, and immune system diseases, and how to prevent and acquire, and how to prevent from acquiring these diseases is going to be next. Within the mental health industry, there's no attempt at finding cures. The pharmaceutical industry develops a tremendous amount of drugs for the mentally ill to take. Their goal is, as a business, is to make profit. And if you were to work on a cure for mental illness, you would sell a whole lot less and make a whole lot less money as a company than if you were to come up with a medication in which a person would have to take for the next 10, 20, or 30 years of their life. And so the pharmaceutical industry has a huge conflict of interest. Do they work on a cure for mental illness, or do they work on drugs that people need to take in order to get relief from the symptoms? And the pharmaceutical industry has chosen to work on drugs for people to take for the rest of their life to give them relief from their symptoms rather than look for a cure. When we did our research for the Canadian Space Agency, this was the basis from which we started. When you go to the internet or you go to any references and look up what causes mental illness or what causes any diseases, when they describe the thing of interest that you're looking up by its symptoms, that's an acknowledgement that they don't know what causes it. All mental illnesses at the time that we did this research were all described by their symptoms. Anxiety, OCD, depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia were all described by their symptoms, which meant that the medical industry did not have a clue as to what caused mental illness. And so what we did in our research was we proposed a model to see if that was possibly the cause, and our results was that in fact the model that we chose to work with was the right one. And this blue just simply says what new information that we developed over time in our research that would help for each one of the mental illnesses, depression, major depression, okay, what new information that we created, which was primarily for the mental illnesses to be able to get off of medication and recover. And so we apply the principles from what's called communication sciences, is how we get, communication science deals with the designing of the systems that route the data, zeros and ones over the internet, any of your routers, any of the digital data on data buses. That's the design of those systems all use communication sciences. And it's a field in electrical engineering. And then we used the results from PHM, the results from AIDS research, from cancer research to predict, prevent, and recover from these illnesses. So, when we looked at mental illness, what we found was that there was a communications problem between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. So we have to state, as in engineering, what is communicating? Communicating isn't just talking. Communicating is sending a message and the message being received. And that does not happen very often. Very rare. So communicating, as we say, is easy, but getting the intended message is nearly impossible. And that's not so true in the electrical field of communications. So in the conscious mind works with our spoken language, voice inflections, body language, and context. That's what the conscious mind uses in the process of communications. Words and sentences have multiple meanings depending on its content. And so it's not used by the fight or flight response. Our fight or flight response is a rule-based system. Rule-based comes from software where they use like an if-then system. If in the software sees this, then the software has to do that. And that's called an if-then rule. And the fight or flight response is a rule-based system. If it sees this, it does that. And if it sees danger, you feel fear. If it sees danger, you'll get frightened. As long as the communications channel between the conscious mind and your fight or flight response hasn't been compromised. And what happens that causes mental illness is that through your existence, usually as a young person, you had to develop survival skills, and that often meant compromising your communications with your fight or flight response, meaning it was sending you message about you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do that, but you couldn't do those things. Perhaps it was your mother that was the danger, or your father was the danger. Well, you couldn't leave your family, and so psychologically you had to come up with a method of living in that environment. And one of the most common things that we do is we become detached from our emotions, from the messages that our fight or flight response is sending the conscious mind. And so the conscious mind only communicates with the fight or flight response externally using our senses. Just like how the fight or flight response normally collects data, it has to hear you talk and say in order for you to communicate with your fight or flight response. You can't do it in meditation. You're not communicating with your fight or flight response or your subconscious. You have to use the way that the fight or flight response gets its data normally. And so the fight or flight response collects all the data it can from all of its senses and then decides what very small amount of information that it's going to send up to the conscious mind in order to create your reality. The fight or flight response gets it all, but the conscious mind can't handle it. It's not geared to handling all that data. So it picks and sends up what it needs to in order to create our reality. And what that means is, and it confirms that my reality is different than yours because we have different brains and our fight or flight responses are differently. But, generally speaking, they're pretty close, so that's why we're able to interact and we can learn and we can hear and stuff. But everybody's reality is just a little bit different than the other person's. So that when the mentally ill who has their chemistry change in their brain, that changes just enough so that their reality no longer is like the normal reality. It's quite a bit different. And so they can't fit. Their behavior no longer fits within the norm as a result. This is a little chart when you're talking about communicating electronically, either like via cell phone or via landline. These are the design parameters that must be satisfied in order for the system to work. And the key parameters are the amount of energy per bit, the ratio of the energy per bit over the amount of electrical noise. That has to be met. And then for analog data, that would be for digital data, in a 0 or a 1, how much energy is in that 1 versus how much energy is in the noise on that line. And then if you're dealing with analog data or continue like a voltage or a temperature or something, for analog data, it's called the signal to noise ratio. How much energy do you have in the signal, again, versus how much energy do you have in the noise? And there are specific values that have to be satisfied in order for these cell phones to work, either via the RF link or internally within the electronics in the cell phone. And the way that these are rated are the amount of bit errors that occur. So if the bit error occurs due to either poor signal strength or some kind of electrical noise, the message that is sent is not going to be the message that was intended. you're going to have noise in the data, which means you're going to get a corrupted message. And so that happens electronically. And so, as I mentioned, signal to noise and the ratios of signal to noise and the ratio of bit energy versus noise energy for different types of way of putting information on electrical lines. And I talked about modulation and demodulation. So here's examples of modulation schemes: biphase shift keying or quadrature phase shift keying, 8 PSK, 8 phase shift keying. These are 3 different ways of putting intelligent information on electrical signals, and then what is the bit error rate going to be for different energy per bit over noise ratios, which is I mentioned on it previously. So for a given ratio from energy to noise, we know exactly what the bit error rate's going to be. And so that knowledge is important in designing a system, because you may want a system that wants 0 bit errors, and so 0 bit errors is down here. So this is the ratio of energy in the bit to EB over N0 that you've got to provide. And so this is the design parameters that electrical engineers use when they design electronic communication systems, cell phones, antennas, any kind. So the theory of communications in the brain that we have today, although it works electronically, it doesn't use those 2 things that I just mentioned, the signal to noise ratio and EB over N0 that we use on electrical lines. It uses a ratio, a chemical ratio. And this is how we believe transmission occurs from one in a cell across the synapse. This would be the synapse joint, and somehow the information gets from across this gap, and this gap is a chemical gap, and so the chemistry in the brain has got to be at a certain ratio in order for all of the information all of the time to be able to get across all the gaps in all of the synapses in the brain, and any tweaking of that causes a corrupted data and corrupted thoughts, corrupted ideas. And so we tried to show how in a similar kind of diagram that we use for an electronic communication system of how the brain would work. And here's the input into the brain, the information from the nervous system, the eyes for vision, the ears, you get sound, the nose, from your nose you get smell, from the skin you get touch, temperature, vibrations. That all goes into the fight or flight response. And then the fight or flight response throws out a little bit of the data up to the conscious mind, okay? And then from the conscious mind, the output is really our reality, okay? And so that's a very simple diagram trying to copy how electrical engineers think about communications and data. So why can PHM technology, communication science, aid the results from AIDS and cancer research, define the cause and recovery process for all of these diseases? And that's because if you look at this chart right here, if this is the brain where the fight or flight response resides, it is connected to everything in the body. It has got full control over everything in the body to do anything that it decides is important. And so this diagram here is meant to show, and I think a lot of people understand, that the conscious mind is really just the tip of the iceberg of the brain. That the great bulk of the brain's processing and intelligence and decision making, what is called the subconscious mind, now is in a dangerous mode. The subconscious mind becomes the fight or flight response. So the great bulk of the brain's processing is done way outside of the purview of the conscious mind. And that's what that diagram is meant to show. So our research for the Canadian Space Agency created the first model for mental illness, and that model was this. This was the model that we used to be able to explain how the fight or flight response could do everything that we claim it does. So the reason that the brain gets mentally ill is, unlike the rest of the human body that's got all these sensors on it that sends information to the brain to tell it when something's wrong, when it's been injured, Well, the brain's encased in a skull. It doesn't have any nerves. In fact, you can cut the brain, it feels no pain. You don't get any feedback. And so it had to develop a way of telling the person's conscious mind when the conscious mind was doing something wrong. And what it came up with was emotions, feelings, okay? And so when the conscious mind accidentally walks into the cave of a bear, okay, the fight or flight response tells the person's conscious mind to get your feet moving and get the heck out of there, okay? Now, if through necessity, that communications path between the fight or flight response, okay, and the conscious mind gets corrupted due to neglect as a child, abuse, whatever it is that the person needed to do in order to survive in its circumstances, it corrupted that communications path. And with that corruption of communications, the fight or flight response detects that the conscious mind isn't taking care of the fight or flight response. And so it continues to increase the consequences of ignoring it, the messages. Our approach for defining what mental illness was, we assumed that the brain and the nervous system was a closed system, and then we used the principles of communications to identify the cause, which was the communications path between the fight or flight response and the conscious mind. We know that the brain communicates between the subconscious and the conscious using feelings, emotions, and even hunches. That's another form of the way that the fight or flight response communicates with the conscious mind is hunches. For instance, you get the idea like you're being watched. That's because the fight or flight response has gotten data from its senses that indicates somebody might be watching you. And so you get this uneasy feeling like, I think I'm being watched. You can't see it at the conscious level, but your fight or flight response is there watching out for you. So we assume that any message that's transmitted by any region of the brain is the exact message that is received. So we asked, well, what happens when the conscious ignores the needs of the subconscious? When the conscious mind ignores the messages from the conscious, the first thing that happens is the conscious mind will experience depression. And what that does, it makes living daily a little bit more difficult. And it's giving you depression to get your attention to start making better decisions. So when depression is ignored and the person keeps making poor decisions according to the fight or flight response, it increases the symptoms to major depression, where you're no longer feeling blue, you're actually feeling hopeless. You're feeling helpless, out of control. And you have to go on medication if you do not change your behavior. So, assuming that you go on medication and you keep making the wrong kinds of decisions, the fight or flight response is aware of that. And so when the symptoms of major depression are ignored, the fight or flight response often causes anxiety disorder, which means that the fight or flight response is able to detect imminent death. When you're feeling anxiety, it means your fight or flight response sees you dying. And that's why you've got anxiety. Somewhere it's able to put the puzzle together to say, if you continue to do the things that you're doing, death will result. And so what happens? People get on anti-anxiety drugs to minimize the symptoms of anxiety. So now with anxiety ignored, the symptoms of major depression are ignored, the fight or flight response causes a self-induced brain damage. It changes the ratio of the chemicals in the brain that then will give you either bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And whether you get one or the other is likely genetically based. But you will get one, and you can actually have symptoms of either. They're so closely tied together. And so what happens when that chemical composition changes? Remember on the synapses, it stops those synapses from transmitting the information that used to go across there. And so that then causes the symptoms of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. The recipe for acquiring a mental illness, very simply put, generally it occurs after 2 to 5 years of overexposure to psychological and or physical danger, as determined by the person's fight or flight response, not the conscious, but the fight or flight response. This then triggers the near continuous release of cortisol and adrenaline that causes premature aging of both the body and shrinkage of the brain, resulting in the feelings of the fight or flight response determining it's powerless to get the conscious mind to remove the threats. The fight or flight response determines it is out of control from the failure of the conscious mind to remove the threat. And then the development of psychological survival strategies occur, including learning to ignore and stuff your feelings and emotions. And that is the basis of the creation of mental illness, when the FOF, the fight or flight response, has determined that the conscious mind can no longer take care of its fight or flight response because the communications path has been destroyed through the survival skills that were developed. The fight or flight response has determined it's unable to get away or have the conscious remove itself from the threat. The fight or flight response forces the conscious mind to experience great pain and discomfort, which forces the people to go on medication. And so the way that you recover from that is by start making the right decisions as determined by the fight or flight response, not the conscious mind. So you've got to start learning to speak in the language of the fight or flight response, which is safety, which is having your fight or flight response thinking that it is in control of itself, of you. It is not powerless. It has the power to make the correct changes. Those are some of the words that the fight or flight response, those are the things that it needs to have to exist in order for people to recover from the mental illness that the fight or flight response caused. This is a list of feelings and resulting experiences that we would feel as a result. Under the word happy, if the subconscious mind allows you feel happy, you might feel pleased or glad, or you might describe yourself as feeling wonderful or being elated. So this is the table that shows the kinds of additional emotions and experiences that we have as people as a result of our different emotions that we experience. Very complex, very, very complex. So under love, when you feel a love, you can be affectionate, you can be intimate, you can have loyalty, you can be friendly to people, you want to be honorable, you want to cherish the other person, or if there's an object of your love, you could be grateful or warm. So this is a very nice table for people to understand what other kind of experiences do we have while we are feeling these messages from our fight or flight response / subconscious. How does the fight or flight response decide that it's safe? I'm going to try to answer that, I think. And so the fight or flight response was developed for our body to eliminate threat that it decides exists immediately by either running away or standing and taking action, which we often call fighting, but taking the right action, okay? So if you do this, okay, the fight or flight response is the most powerful response of the brain. It has the ability to do anything it wants at any time. And it is only designed to be activated for extremely short periods of time, microseconds or milliseconds. Not continuously, because while it's activated, it's releasing cortisol and adrenaline in the body. Adrenaline and cortisol are both toxic chemicals, and our bodies are only designed to have them for extremely short periods of time. Since they are toxic, they destroy tissue. when they are in the body for a length of time. So the brain, this is a diagram that's trying to show what happens to the brain as a result of excessive exposure to two normal occurring chemicals in our body, cortisol and adrenaline, that also happen to be toxic to us for extended periods. So again, this study was done for space, for astronauts, and in space, an astronaut loses 10% of its body every 6 months in space. This includes brain cells from overexposure to the continuous presence of cortisol and adrenaline. This then causes the astronaut to develop unrecoverable poor impulse control as the brain's frontal lobes are reduced in size. All body rhythms, circadian, ultradian, there's 4 of them, I'm going to get to them in a little bit, they're all disrupted. The astronaut brain atrophies overexposure, all as a result of being up in space in zero gravity. Brain damage will likely be expressed later in life rather than when the person is younger. So in the mental health continuum model, this is typically a chart that is meant to just illustrate it very simply. Here you're healthy, everything's working well. Here where you're in a reactive mode, when you're injured and when you're ill, the different things that your body does. And so before mental illness occurs, your fight or flight response gives the conscious mind many, many chances to remove the threat. It does not want to cause mental illness. It wants you to make the right decisions. It wants you to be safe. It wants the fight or flight response wants to think it's safe and see no danger. Okay? And so it's important to know what a threat is, what stress is, what stressors are, and what triggers are. Okay, each of those has a different definition. Obviously, we know what a threat is, danger. Stress is what happens when we're put in a situation where we believe we aren't ready for. That triggers the release of cortisol and adrenaline. Stressors are triggers that the fight or flight response will release cortisol and adrenaline. Okay, those are stressors. Stress is like continuous. Stressors are like one-time events. Triggers is the information that the fight or flight response has defined as deadly. And they initiate the symptoms of mental illness, that usually occurring at a very undesirable time in order to get your attention. So these are some examples of the triggers that we have on our body. Unexplainable high and low blood pressure. Surprise perspiration for unknown reasons. Insomnia. Heart palpitations. Anxiety. Depression. Mood swings. Irritability. Mouth sores. Tongue sores. Lip sores. Chapped lips. Any kind of obsessive OCD type of behavior. Okay? Examples of stressors. Heartburn, hemorrhoids, gastrointestinal issues such as Crohn's disease. Again, mouth and tongue sores, skin infections, pimples, rashes, colds and flus, chapped lips, allergies, all new allergies. Those are all results of stressors. So I'm going to talk about the space program and mental illness and the story of one astronaut, Captain Lisa Nowak. She was in the paper, I think, in 2007 as the astronaut that drove from Houston to Texas by wearing a diaper because she wanted to attack her ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend, which none of that was true, by the way. But she did, as a result of her training and her experiences and her life, she did become mentally ill. And she was up in space, and she had stopped going to space. And the press leaked that she was diagnosed with several severe mental illnesses after her arrest and trial, and she refused to use those in her defense. Instead, what she did was, let's see if I She allowed herself to get kicked out of the get kicked out of the astronaut program, get kicked out of the Navy. She got demoted before she got kicked out of the Navy. So that affected, I don't know if she got any of her pension from the Navy, but if she did, it was a lot less than what it was supposed to be. And that was all because she refused to use, in her defense, mental illness. And she did that because when you're mentally ill, you don't know it. The people that are mentally ill can't stand back objectively and say, hey, gee, I'm really acting weird, you know. They cannot tell that their behavior is any different than what they would do without the mental illness. So from her perspective, she was just fine, and she wasn't going to admit that she had any mental illness. So instead, she allowed herself to be punished severely for acts that really wasn't her response, was caused by her mental illness. There's a real common understanding that mental illness may be a result of genetic behavior. And so I want to cover that. The idea that mental illness runs in families must be genetic based then, because if you have lots of mental illness in the family, it must be genetic. Well, if you're a parent and you're mentally ill, by definition, you cannot take care of yourself. And so if you have children, if you can't take care of yourself properly, you're not going to be able to take care of your children properly. And so if you've got a lifestyle in which it caused you to go mentally ill, your children are being exposed to that same lifestyle, and you are now going to cause, your lifestyle is now going to cause your children or relatives or whatever to become mentally ill. And so the idea that mental illness is genetic is a way of allowing parents who were mentally or emotionally ill and really didn't have everything that it took to raise their children properly, and cause them to develop survival mechanisms in order to survive in that family environment. And that survival mechanism, the most common one, is to disconnect the communications path from the conscious to the fight or flight response, corrupting the communications, becoming emotionally ill with depression, major depression, and then onward to mental illness if that environment isn't changed. So, my belief are the results of our research showed that mental illness is completely environmental.